let's imagine that we're in court and we're being asked to account for our behavior. The story that we will come up with in court, and we can think about this in the context of being kids in front of our parents or in front of teachers or even your boss. Why did you do what you did? We will come up with a story that sounds as plausible and as credible as possible. And sometimes that might involve lying, but sometimes that might just involve just misrepresenting what actually happened. We do something stupid and we think that's a bit embarrassing. I need a better story than the reality to be able to justify and explain what I'm doing, particularly if there are things at stake. And so that's a really good illustration of the capabilities that we have to find explanations for things that we might not necessarily be able to explain. And so the brain, there's a lot of work being done into this. So Daniel Kahneman, people may have heard of with his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, really points out very simply that what we're good at is making quick decisions. And then we use those powerful bits of the brain to sort of post-rationalize why we've done it.
That's Christian Hunt, CEO of Human Risk and author of the book, Humanizing Rules, bringing behavioral science to ethics and compliance. I am Dr. Hemma Lomax, and this is Unless the Podcast. Christian Hunt is the founder of Human Risk Limited, a consultancy specializing in the application of behavioral science in risk, compliance, conduct, and culture. He has extensive experience in financial services, having held senior roles such as Head of Compliance and Operational Risk Control at UBS Asset Management and Chief Operating Officer of the Prudential Regulation Authority at the Bank of England. Christian is known for pioneering the use of behavioral science in compliance and risk management, focusing on influencing human decision-making. At Human Risk, Christian helps his clients solve puzzles, challenges that are human, complex and fascinating, and that demand curiosity and creativity. Christian, welcome to Unless the Podcast. I am so happy to have you join us today.
I'm absolutely thrilled to be here, Hemma. Thank you for having me.
Well, we always have so much fun when we get together, and I know we're going to have a great conversation, but I'm just giddy with the excitement that I get to share you with my guest today. So let's jump in. I like to ask my guests to explain what you do. So let me give you a few seconds just to say in your own words what you do at Human Risk. What is it to you?
Sure. So it's probably best if I define what human risk is, because it's a term that people understand, but you could define it a multitude of different ways. And I define it very, very loosely, which upsets some people because it's quite a broad definition. I define it as the risk of people doing things they shouldn't or not doing things they should. And what you'll notice is I've encompassed the full range of what might go wrong when humans make bad calls. And so that's everything from somebody deliberately setting out to commit fraud to maybe somebody who's just a bit tired and has made an honest mistake. And I've covered in that definition the act of commission of errors. So doing things, you make a mistake. And we often think about mistake, wrongdoing as being making a mistake, taking a risk, getting something wrong. But there's the other side of it, which is not doing something that you need to do. Locking a door would be a really good illustration of that. And so I'm encompassing errors of omission as well, so failure to do something. And so when you look at that definition, what does that cover? Well, the answer is compliance and ethics sit at the core of that, but you've also got health and safety, cybersecurity, information security, but also just general management of people. And so human risk is a definition that covers all those things. And I help people to think about how can we create frameworks and processes that make it more likely we'll get the outcomes we're looking for and less likely that we won't. And I started off with that human risk, very negative formulation. You talked about my background being in risk and compliance. But also, what I've increasingly realized is that there's an opposite side to it, which is what I call human reward, just to get the risk-reward balance out there, by which I mean getting the best out of people. Not the most out of them, not exploitative, but how do we get the best out of people? And if we're hiring humans in the 21st century, what we need to recognize is two things. The first one is to get the best out of them involves us thinking really about designing environments that will allow them to do that. And then the second bit is that people are the largest risk facing any organization. When things go wrong, there's always a human component involved, either causing a problem in the first place or making it worse by the way that they react or don't react to a situation. And so when we look at this, what I'm doing is really helping organizations to tread that fine line between recognizing people are the biggest risk, but they're also, and we say this quite frequently, the biggest asset of organizations. And so we have to think carefully about how we balance those two things out. So bringing behavioral science and creativity to try and help solve those problems.
Oh, I love that. Look, people are going to people, right?
Totally.
When I see you talking about human risk, it gets me very excited because, not just because of my day job as an ethics and compliance professional, but my day job as a parent, or really my day job as a person that bumbles around making mistakes and doing things wrong and forgetting to shut doors. So we're all guilty of these things as humans. We obviously need to influence other humans, whether it's our own little ones or our employees or, our family members. And it sounds like you've gone deep into the behavioral science to see how we can understand and unlock some of that. Is that right?
Yeah, so this came about, and you talked about the sort of two of the jobs that I've had in my past. I've had a little bit of an eclectic career, which with hindsight, I can give you a nice narrative about why I moved on to do this next role. But frankly, it was just looking for interesting opportunities. And so I had a very unique experience of being a regulator. And I always have to stress this because it's financial services. So post the 2008 crisis, they were looking for people in the UK who weren't natural regulators. And I had a background in financial services. And so I sort of became an accidental regulator and spent most of my time in regulation. Before I became the COO, I was responsible for international banking supervision. So that's looking at international banks based in London. And a firm that I spent a lot of time with there was UBS. And as anybody who works in a regulated industry will know, if a regulator is spending a lot of time looking at you, it is not because you are doing a stellar job. And so a lot of my regulatory career was based on looking at problems. And 7 days after I got this role, UBS had a rogue trader in London that I had to manage. So a lot of my regulatory career was driven by the things that had gone wrong at UBS. And when it came to leaving the regulator, I was thinking, well, where do I go? And the reason I wanted to leave the regulator was it had been broken up. We joined the central bank. I didn't want to be a central banker. And I thought, where can I go? And the logical place to go was the industry that I've been looking at. And so UBS loomed large, and I joined them because they'd had so many problems that I knew they were trying to do the right thing. And I didn't want to go somewhere to be a spin doctor for bad behavior. So I joined UBS and ended up with this really interesting experience of eating my own regulatory cooking, in the sense that I, as the regulator, had imposed things on the firm, and then I was suddenly having to implement. And what was really interesting about the experience I had was that I was given a portfolio at UBS that was probably the one bit of the firm that hadn't had an issue, at least not a big blow up that had been on a sort of regulatory radar. And so I was having to implement things that I, as a regulator, had thought of in terms of the firm as a whole, which weren't bearing in mind the business area that I was in. And that's asset management is slightly unique in financial services relative to things like investment banking and wealth management, which were the other bits of the firm that had challenges. And so I'm having to implement these things, and I'm saying, well, this is not landing. And I knew it wasn't landing because it wasn't landing with me. So I would get emails from myself out of the machine. So, the system would generate this email saying invitation to mandatory training. That, of course, is an irritating phrase because it's either mandatory or it's an invitation. It can't be both. And so I'd get emails from myself inviting me to take this mandatory training. And I was like, what is this? And then I would own policies that I didn't really understand either. And they were policies that were well-intentioned and made sense in the context in which they've been imposed. But when you took them into a different context, suddenly they were at best unhelpful, and worst case actually caused problems because they were forcing things that made no sense whatsoever. And so I was like, I've got to solve this problem because I know where it's come from and I'm owning it. My name is behind this. And so, I went because I was like, I've got to solve this problem. And so I looked for what is the solution to this problem? Why is this stuff that's very sensible, in theory, not landing where we are? And I realized we were not, some of it was we were not thinking necessarily about all the nuances of the individual businesses, but particularly we were not thinking about the people that were at the end of this. And so this realization that compliance is the business of influencing human decision-making, because you can't say to a legal entity or a building or a website or an organization, be compliant and expect a response. It's the people within it that need that. And so behavioral science suddenly loomed large as I was like, well, if we're in the business of influencing human decision-making, shouldn't we understand how to do that? And once you make that leap and you suddenly go, oh, policies we write for people to read, training is for people, communication is for people. We need to influence what people are doing and not doing to get the outcomes we're looking for. And so to solve the compliance problem requires us to influence humans. Well, if you want to do that, isn't it a good idea to understand how that works? And so from then, it's a logical step to looking and saying, well, I really need to. This isn't just interesting, right? Which was my passion for it to start with. It was like, this is super relevant. I need to get on top of this. And the more you get on top of it, the more you realize that actually a lot of the presumptions, and this is not a criticism of UBS or financial services, this is a broader problem. A lot of the problems that we have, and a lot of the approaches that we try and solve, or a lot of the approaches we use to try and solve those problems, make presumptions about human decision-making that are not valid. That, for example, humans are logical, and we're not always logical. And if we start to recognize that, we can design systems that are more likely to succeed.
And we're not always logical. You make such a good point, and we're applying the lack of logic to this process. It's like, oh, this will work. And I know you spent some time writing about this in your book and thinking about this, but I'm always interested in the why. Like, why did we get it so wrong? And you've given a few tips there, but operationalizing these good intentions, these sensible intentions in the workplace with adults is difficult. It's challenging, right? And I love this analogy you use of the pizza cutter and the scissors that you use. And I laugh at that because I still have one of those roly things to cut my pizza. And I think I'm advanced from the days when I was a kid when I had a knife. But I want you to tell the story because I'm going to butcher it. But you use pizza scissors, and there's an idea of getting the right tools to do the right thing. I think it was your dad that said
Yeah.
the right tools. So tell that story for our
Yeah,
listeners.
so I was brought up by, my dad was always a big way because he was very good with his hands, and he was used to say to me, you need the right tools for the job, right? And we all know situations where we kind of fudge it. We'll use a chair as a ladder because we have nothing else, or we're too lazy to go and get the ladder. And we've all used utensils in the kitchen that are not necessarily fit for purpose. And so one of the things I was looking for an analogy, it was like I want something that's that's a bit unusual that people might not have come across, but that sort of makes the point that we should think about what we're using to do it. And so you're right. Most people who cut pizza use one of those little wheel things that you roll across. And if we're honest, it's not particularly effective, right? You have to sort of roll backwards and forwards, and it's a bit. And so I discovered when I was traveling, and I'm always on the lookout for things that are different or unusual. This is why I love travel, right? Go see what people do differently. Either so you can go, what the hell is that? I don't understand it, and try and make sense of it, or never to do that again yourself. Or you might go, this is a brilliant idea. Anyway, I was in Naples, and they know a thing or two about pizza in Naples. And one of the things that's really cool there, if you want to buy pizza, is you're not forced to buy a predetermined slice of pizza. You can have whatever size of pizza slice you like. And the way they manage that is they use scissors to cut the slice. So all that happens is you point to the pizza, you point to the size you would like, they cut you the piece of pizza, and then they weigh it. And that's how they determine it. So I was like, this is brilliant. This is bespoke, right? I can have exactly the size that I want. And I looked, I thought these scissors are absolutely brilliant. And they're not normal scissors. You can cut pizza with normal scissors. They are specially designed scissors. And I thought, this is amazing. Anyway, so this has always stuck with me as being like it's a really simple solution, because once you look at it, you think, well, you are cutting through. Scissors are the most logical utensil to have. And so I talked about the book. I've actually had some human risk scissors made, so I will get you a pair.
Oh,
Hemma.
yes, please.
I've had a proper sort of old school scissor manufacturer who does nothing but make scissors. And this is, I think, another key thing, thinking about your tools for the job. Really need to know what you're doing to get the right impact. These are people that do nothing but make scissors, and I've had some special bespoke pizza scissors made by them. But yeah, it's basically this idea of saying, I think we need to look really carefully and say, if we're going to do something, let's make sure that we're using the absolute best possible tool for the job. And from a behavioral perspective, things that we think are logical or that we have always done have an element of that round pizza wheel, which is like, this is what I see everybody else doing. This is what we do. This is what I've seen available in the supermarket. Isn't that the right answer? And so the Neapolitan pizza equivalent is to sort of go, well, let's have a look around and let's see, has somebody else solved this problem somewhere else in a different way that we maybe can learn from? And so the pizza scissors for me are a nice analogy that we can think about. Are we using the right behavioral tool to solve the problem that we have? And often I think we're not. We're just using what we've always used or what we see other people using. And maybe we have got it right, but let's know that and let's do everything for a reason, so that when we're investing people's time and money, we're doing it, with a greater likelihood of getting a good outcome.
It's so quintessentially human, isn't it, to call something logic when actually all it really is what we've been always doing. And I love that you make that distinction, because again, the illogical part of what you do for me also is, well, we're humans. Why do I need to learn about being human? I'm a human. Why do I need to know about behavioral science? So what does a human miss about behavioral science? Like you've mentioned one, we tend to stick to the status quo, or the things we see other people doing. But what other lessons have you learned there in terms of the illogical things that humans do?
I mean, the brilliant thing is, if you were to let's imagine that we're in court and we're being asked to account for our behavior. The story that we will come up with in court, and we can think about this in the context of being kids in front of our parents or in front of teachers or even your boss. Why did you do what you did? We will come up with a story that sounds as plausible and as credible as possible. And sometimes that might involve lying, but sometimes that might just involve just misrepresenting what actually happened. We do something stupid and we think, that's a bit embarrassing. I need a better story than the reality to be able to justify and explain what I'm doing, particularly if there are things at stake. And so that's a really good illustration of the capabilities that we have to find explanations for things that we might not necessarily be able to explain. And so the brain, there's a lot of work being done into this. So Daniel Kahneman, people may have heard of, with his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, really points out very simply that what we're good at is making quick decisions. And then we use those powerful bits of the brain to sort of post-rationalize why we've done it. And if you want another illustration of where that's at play, look at advertising. Tons of ridiculous advertisements out there that logically shouldn't work, right? Why should some of these advertisements that we see, if I think in the US, good example for your US listeners, the Geico lizard, right? Here's a lizard that is selling, or gecko, I think it is, isn't it? But it's selling insurance. And there's this talking animal that incentivizes people. Actually, there seems to be something about insurance because in the UK, we have like meerkats that sell insurance, all these strange things. Now, why would I buy an insurance policy based on what some animal is telling me? Well, the answer is it appeals to us on some level. Now, if you asked anybody that's buying insurance, they would probably say, well, it's a brand I recognize and understand. The policy was very good. But chances are a large part of the purchasing decision was based around the advertisements. And those adverts must work because otherwise the companies wouldn't spend the millions or billions that they spend on them. So if we look at advertising as being an illogical thing that gets us to change our behavior, we can start to see that humans aren't always rational. And nor would we want to be rational because being rational is a bit weird, right? It's sort of, if we were entirely logical about everything, we would do weird stuff. And so when we look at that, we know that we have the capability to come up with really good explanations. And what behavioral science is trying to do is to peer behind that and say, look, I know what people say are the reasons that they did things, but can we try and identify what those might actually be? Now, sometimes it is exactly what people have said, but more often than not, there are other things at play, things that we don't necessarily recognize or we don't want to admit to. And if we can start to unpick those, we can find clever techniques to try and influence people more effectively.
Nice. Well, look, I want to separate the different people in this scenario. So you've got the regulators. You were a regulator, so was I. Then you've got the compliance professionals, like the role I've been in quite a lot, and I know you've held as well, where we have to decide what to do. And then we've got the employees. So I'm going to take those one at a time for a second. So the regulators. In what way are the regulators illogical when it comes to making these rules? Let's say for the Prudential Authority for the banking in the UK.
Yeah. So if I regulators, I should start off by saying having been one, I've got a huge amount of sympathy. Now, I'm also irritated by stupid regulation that impacts all of us on a day-to-day basis. It's very easy to criticize regulators, but it's actually quite a tough job. And regulators sit in this horrible space in between the politicians and the people that they are regulating. And so they come under huge amounts of pressure. And so a lot of the pressure on regulators is to be seen. People, they will judge you by your outcomes, but we will also judge you on the way that we perceive you are doing things. And so regulators end up having to do things for the sake of being seen to do them. So politicians will go, what are you doing about this particular thing? And they will have to, they have to come up with a logical answer. They have to justify what they're doing. And it's much easier to justify logical things than it is illogical things. If in marketing, it's perfectly okay to go, I've had this crazy idea. We should just try this, see what happens. If you do that in regulation, people go, well, that sounds irresponsible. And of course, there are certain aspects of regulation where we do want to be logical. If we're looking at the physical environment, we can predict what happens, for example, if we mix water and electricity, not a good outcome. So we don't want people experimenting with in that space. So there are certain types of regulation. If we think about safety rules, airline safety, for example, please just strictly follow these logical protocols, don't we? But if we think about how do we influence people, say in the banking industry, not to be greedy or to make immoral decisions, so we have to depend on different levers. So regulators are sat in this space, managing the realities of human behavior, but actually having to also justify it to politicians who, of course, have their own motives and drivers. So they're stuck very much in the middle. So I would say that what regulators often fall into the trap of doing is, for very understandable reasons, by the way, is because to basically to have a logical solution, to have a justifiable solution. So even if you fail at your objective, if you failed in an intelligent way, we tried this logical approach and for some reason it didn't work. That is much better than feeling like we tried something crazy. If you want a good analogy, actually, is if you think about the game of football in my language, so soccer for American listeners, right? Penalty in that sport, the most sensible thing for the penalty taker and the goalkeeper to do is to stay in the middle, right? So if you want to score the goal, the easiest place to score is straight down the middle. Ditto for the goalkeeper, the most likely way is to stay in the middle, is not to dive one way or the other. But both it's a high risk strategy to either kick the ball straight down the middle, because if you get stopped, you look like an idiot. And if you're a goalkeeper, standing in the middle and it's gone in the side means you didn't make any effort whatsoever. But the logical thing to do it would, the sensible, rational thing to do would be to stay in the middle. But actually, we end up making emotional decisions around that. So there's an illustration between logically what to do and the realities of this decision making. So I think regulators are in this tough bind of needing to justify what they're doing, justify spending public money, and that leads you to the logical world. That's not necessarily the most effective. Very long answer. I'll try and keep the other one shorter, but let's go to the next category.
No, it's good because they all interrelate. So okay, let's move to the compliance officer, because I know you've written about the illogical things we do sometimes, whether it's the old tools or the old ways, training upon training. So what's your experience with the compliance officer in that role? What are their intentions and how are they being illogical about that?
Same dynamic as regulators, right? Stuck in the middle. So in the same way that regulators are stuck between politicians and the regulated industry, you've got compliance who are stuck between the people that are regulating, so the business, if you like, and the regulators. And so compliance are having to do things to keep regulators happy. And we've already concluded that regulators are not always doing things that are effective. They're doing things that are logical. And so compliance people have this challenge of, well, I need to make something happen within my organization. That might be something the organization would naturally do, or it might be something that the organization, frankly, if the regulation wasn't there, wouldn't do, which is, of course, why we have regulation. And so they're stuck in this thing of having to keep regulators happy, but also recognizing that they want to use their initiative and do things that make sense in their own environment. So the trap, I guess, for compliance people is, again, to think logically, to engage in what is known as defensive decision making. So do things so that if it goes wrong, you have a better case than you would otherwise, because it's logical and so passes the courtroom test, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
And so the challenge that they've got is that often they feel hemmed in by constraints that are imposed on by the organization. So financial constraints, what the organizations are willing to tolerate, and then the constraints that regulators, and in the US particularly, prosecutors are putting on them to say you need to deliver this. And one of the interesting things is whenever I have conversations with people in the US, there's always like, well, what do prosecutors think about this? Now, my European brain goes straight to, why are we talking about prosecution? Right. And I understand the logic of why, right? Because that's the big thing that looms large. But the logic there seems to be, how do I defend it in the courtroom, as opposed to how do I stop it happening in the first place? Yeah. And so I think that's the biggest risk there, is that people talk very often about the act that we are trying to, FCPA would be the sort of flagship in the US. If this is the thing that we're worrying about, so we're always looking at the negative consequences.
Right.
Well, imagine we were driving and we're looking at the negative, I don't want to get caught speeding. We might actually drive really dangerously, too slow because we don't want to get caught by, or in a manner where we're paying so much attention to the signage and the likelihood of getting caught than we are monitoring the risks of the traffic around us. And so if we look at that, there's a real challenge there, I think, of I don't want to get myself into massive amounts of trouble. And particularly as we see more and more compliance people, being pursued themselves, having to take personal responsibility for what's going on. You can kind of see how this happens. But the challenge is that if you ask them, if you gave them a bit more latitude to do things there, you might get some different answers. So the trap, I think, is often to say, well, the easiest thing for me to do is to say, well, see what the regulator wants, what kept them happy last time, what are the other people in our industry doing? Let's just keep doing that and whisper it. But if we get into trouble, then at least we're in good company, right? We're not the weirdo outliers that are doing something different, where if it goes wrong, the question will be, why are you doing something different? We're in the pack. And if the pack gets into trouble, well, then everybody's in trouble. It's not my fault. And so that's the challenge that they've got. And so all of this stuff is behavioral. We have to recognize, I talk about the challenge of compliance being the behavioral bit of the business, but actually there's a behavioral piece for compliance officers as well. And therefore regulators need to be thinking about what influence are they having. And I always say to regulators, whatever you do to firms will probably be replicated by compliance officers, right? They will copy the behavior, a little bit like we copy our parents. They will copy what you do. And so those are some of the pressures that are on them. I said I'd give you a quicker answer. I didn't.
No,
it was even longer,
and I'm not going to let you do this fast because this is a really important one. I honestly hate the answer, not because it's wrong, but because it's true, right? And I see, as you said, some of these things could be counterproductive, right? And you and I often talk about, well, what about the employee experience? Like what impact are we having, therefore, by being a fear-mongering, defensive, thinking that our boss is the regulator and not anyone else? And I've certainly seen that where business partners will say, I'm sorry, do you work for the government? Do you still work for the government? Because again, we're supposed to be in this place where we're working for the business and trying to help them keep moving forward. And a lot of what you said, I think, translates in practice to friction and slow down and don't do this and be the office of no and be the office of block. So it definitely makes you feel uncomfortable. I can totally empathize with and understand why we start there. But certainly, I think the challenge is to really focus on the employee experience. I know that's something you talk about a lot in terms of looking at it from the employee perspective. So let me hear what you've got to say on that point, because I feel very uncomfortable about that positioning of the compliance officer, although I recognize it as true.
Yeah, so I look at this thing very simply and say that often when we are thinking about compliance, risk management, and again, the reason the human risk definition is so broad is that these principles I'm talking about would apply to any situation where we're trying to impose rules or principles on people. We're trying to get them to follow rules or principles that they know already. Is we're trying to influence their behavior. The challenge is that it's so tempting to rely on what I call the employment contract fallacy. And the employment contract fallacy is just it's done slightly to irritate lawyers, right? Which is to sort of go, an employment contract from a legal perspective is that gives the employer rights over the employee. So that might be a classic theme du jour. That might be how many days we want you to be in the office. It might be a dress code. It might be when we want you to be, stuff we need you to do. And because you've signed the employment contract, we have rights over you that we are going to exercise. And therefore, the whole approach of compliance, health and safety, whatever, is basically we are allowed to tell you what to do and you will do it. Now, that is legally correct. And there are going to be times where you want to enforce on that basis. So if the consequences of somebody not following a process are, somebody gets killed or injured, then that's a very sensible place to say this is what you need to do and there's no deviation. Right? I don't want any creativity. So airlines classic example, just follow protocol. Right? Don't skip any steps, don't bend the rules, don't do it, just do exactly what it says here, because that is how we keep people, yourselves included, safe. There are other things where it's less easy to monitor what's going on. You may only find out afterwards, or there is a qualitative component to compliance. So being ethical is a good example. It's very hard to codify always what being ethical means because that changes from situation to situation. And we're going to need people's engagement in order to do that. We need them to think for themselves, to do things when we're not in the room, when we can't see it, or we might never find out, or we might find out afterwards. Or where, a little bit like to deliver really good customer service, your heart needs to be in it. You need to be thinking really. So ditto, we might think about some of the rules and processes that we need people to follow may have a component of that involved in it. If we start using the employment contract fallacy as a logic to drive behavior there, we're less likely to get the outcomes we're looking for because one, it's difficult to codify, but two, some of these things, you don't want to force these things. You want people to be doing it, of their own free accord so they can be thinking for themselves and not slavishly following rules. And so if we use that construct all of the time, we're unlikely to get the outcomes we're looking for. We're also going to irritate the hell out of people. Because, bottom line is none of us likes being told what to do. We will accept it up to a certain point, but beyond that point, it gets better. So my point to people is to say, of course, use what I call the employment contract fallacy in situations where that makes sense. But think about, where can we not use it? Where might we want to rely on people's goodwill? Where might we want to work with them? And if we think about things like whistleblowing or speak up, I want people to come to me. Now, if I've spent my whole time treating them like they are small children, telling them what to do, they're not going to necessarily want to engage with me because that doesn't build a relationship of trust. And so my suggestion is that we think more broadly than that and recognize that the relationship between employer and employee is quite complex nowadays. And of course, that shifts with the nature of the economy, where people, all sorts of, it's a very movable feast. And there are going to be times where employers have a greater amount of power and can wield more power over employees. It depends on how educated are the workforce, what alternatives do they have, all those sorts of things. So this waxes and wanes a little bit. But in broad principles, we need to start thinking about, where is it we need them to be on board to get the outcomes we're looking for. And so that's not a case of just telling people what to do or telling them to slavishly follow rules. And so all of that means that compliance is quite complicated because there are things that are hard and fast rules that are easily codifiable. And there are things that are much harder to codify. And the way we might want to enforce or influence one could be very different to another. And they're not separate things. So if you have a compliance function that feels very bureaucratic, that just shouts at you the whole time, tells you what to do, you might do that stuff that requires that, but you're also not going to engage with them preemptively because you're going to go, these are people that don't understand the real world. They just shout at us. I don't want to talk to those people. I'm going to avoid it. And so it's a really delicate balancing act, I think, between, and if you then add in things like enforcement actions that some compliance functions are responsible for discipline, that adds an extra dynamic to it. So it all gets quite complicated. But the key bit here is, I think, looking and saying, what are we trying to do? and how we're trying to influence people. And if we want to get that right, it's not a case of us thinking logically. From our perspective, we need to flip it around and say, what does this feel like for them? We need to start thinking about the employee experience journey, pick whatever word you want from customer services vocabulary, and say, how does this feel? And recognize not how we would like it to feel, but how it is likely to feel. And then we can start to recognize where are our rules challenging, difficult, and awkward, and where perhaps is it much easier for employees to do this. And then we can think about the risks posed by different rules, different requirements, because they're not all the same.
No, and I want to talk about the employee, but let me be provocative. Why should we care what the employees feel? Certainly, we're in an environment now where there's a bit of a tug of war with the employment contract fallacies. You said it, and also, people having certain rights at work in terms of the way they feel. But is this related to productivity down the road? What is it that we should be doing to motivate everyone to be thinking about the employee experience?
Yeah. So the bottom line is, I joke about the employment contract fallacy. If people sign an employment contract, that gives you those legal rights, and you can choose to enforce those, right? You could create a very draconian sort of working environment where you say, I'm going to tell you exactly what to do, and you're going to do it, and I don't care what you think. And that's absolutely fine. There may be situations in which you can get away with that. But if we think about lots of the tasks that we're giving human beings in the 21st century, those are things where we need humans to do it, because otherwise we give it to machines. So if it's a repeat predictable task, where we can determine all the parameters that are there and just program it. And of course, AI is shifting this ground a little bit. But let's just think about physical robots, for example, working in factories. If it's a repeat programmable task, we'll give it to a machine. It makes much more sense. So what are we hiring people to do in the 21st century? The answer is skills the machines can't yet do. And that typically involves skills like judgment, nuance, emotional intelligence, the human touch in the loosest possible sense. And if we want those things to be activated, then we need to be really careful, because that is when people are at their absolute best. That's when we can deliver things the machines can't yet, but it's also when they pose the greatest amount of risk. And so we are putting, I always joke and say, actually, giving someone an email address with your corporate thing, and possibly you might even argue allowing them to have a LinkedIn profile associated with your company, is putting weapons of mass destruction in terms of reputational risk in their hands, right? And we see this happens all the time. Someone at a check-in desk says something inappropriate to a passenger, and that goes viral on social media. Your employees can now cause you huge amounts of individual risk, let alone the things that they might do with the systems that are there, or the people that they might deter from using your business, people might deter from working for your business. There is a degree of employee power that is there. And so if we want to get people to get the best out of people, the human reward piece I was making earlier, then we have to tread a little bit carefully there and recognize the nature of the employment contract. If we want people to go above and beyond, to do more than the absolute basics, then maybe we need to work with them a little bit more. And there are going to be some contexts in which you, as an employer, can get away with a whole load of things. Other contexts in which actually there's much more power with the employee than with the employer. And you need to work out where that stands. But of course, as I said before, that's a movable feast. So you can irritate the hell out of people up to a point, but if the economy shifts, they may well go somewhere else, or you may think that they are doing all the things you want because you can't monitor certain aspects of what they're up to. Unless you, and of course AI will help with this. You can't be in every single meeting. Historically, you couldn't be in every single customer relationship. You don't know what it is your employee, speak up, whistleblowing, reporting things early. You don't know what it is you're not hearing. And so for all of those things where we need buy-in, the more draconian we are, the harder it is to get that. The other thing is, the more draconian you are, the more expensive it is, right? So the more I have to supervise you, and because if I'm in this sort of antagonistic relationship where I'm telling you what to do and I expect you to comply because I employ you, I'm probably going to have to put some controls in place to make sure that's happening. Well, that's even with AI, that starts to get expensive and draining and exhausting. So it's much more expensive if you don't trust people than it is if you do trust them. And the challenge is, of course, when something goes wrong, the tendency is more towards we don't trust you. We'll treat you more like small children. We'll monitor what you're doing. We'll put more controls around it. Really hard to get out of that. And so you end up down this vicious spiral. And so really what I'm saying to people is, if we're employing people, let's recognize what we're employing them for, the nature of the task, and let's recognize that human beings generally don't like being told what to do. So we have to think about how we manage that.
You mentioned the phrase, getting the best out of people or humans being their best selves. And I think that's really critical here because all of the other stuff is still fear-based, right? It's like this idea of individuals being weapons of mass destruction. I know in your book you qualify that. You say there was a time, right? A different industrial revolution maybe, where it was the people at the top that could do the most damage and people didn't have access to do that damage. But now with, like you said, the social media, the phones, the laptops, any individual can do a lot of damage, but then we start to see them as an internal threat, and it's really hard to bring out the best in someone when you see them as an internal threat. So I think there's a bit of a mind shift there that we need. It's like if we've got to think about consequences of seeing our employees as an internal threat, and maybe try to look for the rewards, to your point, of getting the best out of the people that we employ and really leveraging the talent that we're paying for. What do you think about that?
Well, I'd say it's interesting when you talk about the talent that we're paying for. So if I looked at the way we treat humans and the way that we manage, say, plant and machinery, you know that if you don't maintain plant and machinery, that it's going to break down at some point. And depending on what it's doing, that could be an incredibly undesirable thing. We wouldn't generally deploy plant and machinery to do things that it's not designed to do. And yet with humans, what we often do is we push people to the limit. So we don't maintain them in that particular sense. I'm horrified by the amount of vacation that people get in the US. This 2 weeks a year, I come at it from a European perspective where sort of 4 or 5 weeks is perfectly normal, tons of public holidays, let alone before we get into healthcare and all the other sorts of things, right? That seems to me, and I understand why, right? From a commercial business perspective, it's expensive to give people time off. But I think it allows them to recharge and manage those things. And so if we started to think about humans as a resource, let's go for the irony of HR being called human resources. Let's look at how do we manage that resource? Well, I think sort of pushing that resource to its limits, getting it to do things it's not suitable for, running it ragged, isn't necessarily a smart strategy because we wouldn't do that with anything else. It doesn't necessarily make sense. And so I think it's a case of thinking that stuff through. And again, you've rightly made the point that actually potentially in the current climate, employers have a bit more influence and power and ability, and what employees think is potentially something that they don't necessarily need to listen to in the way they did before. But overall, direction of travel is that humans are, there is still a huge amount of power with the every employee. And we've got to remember that employees are sentient. And I think this is the absolutely key bit, is I can get away with stuff, but I will provoke a reaction. And the question is the reaction understandable? Can you understand it and can you manage it? So if I irritate the hell out of people, how might they exact their revenge? And, I think the idea that they won't even think about doing that is you might be lucky, but chances are if somebody irritates me enough, I'm going to find a way to try and get it back. So the more employers clamp down on people, demonstrate they don't trust them, at some point the employee will start to fight back. And you don't know where that might manifest itself. That could cause you recruitment problems. You could have a lower level of customer service. You could have people just working to rule, whatever it is. And that's the risk that you're running, because this isn't a nil-sum game. People will respond to the way that you engage them. And so the question is, can you monitor every single thing they're doing? Maybe, but maybe not.
And the instinct would be then to double down and triple down and try to monitor everything they do, right? So it's like, which comes first there, the chicken or the egg? Like, are we causing these conditions, right? And therefore we're going to have these rogue traders, and in the case of UBS or whatever it might be, or can we go on an upward spiral where instead of the command to control, where we cause the risk and then we have to deal with the risk over and over again, maybe we can do the trust and inspire. I'm quoting Stephen Covey. His book's called Trust and Inspire, and he talks about the difference between command and control and trust and inspire. And of course, as compliance professionals, we clearly sit in the command and control space. I mean, it's you talk about health and safety, you talk about airplanes. Of course, I'm thinking of the tragedy in Turkey that happened this last week. 66 or more people died. The news is trickling in that maybe the fire alarms didn't work, or the fire doors weren't shut, or all sorts of health and safety things. Or we've heard the tragedies at Boeing where, you might make a joke about screws on doors, but it's happening. Like, people are not even doing those things right now. Do we need command and control, or do we need trust and inspire? I wonder what you think about that.
So there's a really interesting balancing act here, right? Because go too far one way and you cause problems. And with all these things, there isn't. This is why it's much easier just to sort of have a simple model and just go, well, we'll just tell them what to do and get on with it, right? So part of the attraction of that traditional approach is it's easy. But if we look at industries that generally do well, and the airline industry, I think is a really good illustration. If you think about the nature of the activity, that is incredibly, I mean, the risk of putting pressurized metal tubes full of people up in the sky, I think they estimate it's something like there's 1 million people in the sky at any one time.
Crazy.
Right. If you think about the number of accidents that happen, it's very, 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 each one entirely undesirable, but very, very, very small amounts relative to the amount of traffic that's there. There's the old adage of it is more dangerous to drive to the airport, greater risk there than you are actually on the flight. And so if we look at that, how have they got that point? Well, there's two separate and potentially might seem contradictory dynamics going on in the airline industry. On the one hand, a very, very, very tight adherence to checklist processes, protocols, rules, and you step out of line on that is a problem. The second thing, however, is that the regulators have recognized that you need to also see that the humans in the system are fallible, but also the humans can provide a great reporting system. You can clock things that the machines might not. And so they have a culture of saying, look, we need people to come forward. And you get into more trouble in the airline industry for not coming forward than you do for coming forward. And so I visited one airline because I'm fascinated. How does this work? And I'm fascinated. And they said, look, if a member of cabin crew comes to us, or even somebody's in the cockpit and says, I've got a drug problem, they will help them to get rehab with the aim of putting them back in the air. And they said, you're probably horrified by that. I said, well, that makes perfect sense to me, because if you were somebody who thought, I'm not going to come forward and admit I've got a problem because actually I'm going to lose my job, then there's no incentive on you to come forward. So they recognize that actually you need to encourage people to come forward. And so that's a very, very human approach that goes alongside you must follow the protocol piece. And so that's encouraged both by the firms themselves, because it's in their interest to make sure it's safe, but also the regulators encourage that, and the regulators want firms to come forward. And so it's known as having a just culture approach. It's recognizing those foibles. And so there's a really good example of an industry that's simultaneously very, very strict on complying with the rules. You don't want to put a plane up in the sky that potentially has mechanical faults, because we know what happens. But equally, let's recognize the human side of it. And I think that balancing act, and that's demonstrated by the fact that we have, relatively speaking, very few accidents. And what's interesting is often when there is always a human, back to my human risk thing, there's always a human component involved generally. And we go back and look at it and go, that was human error. We need to do something about that. Occasionally mechanical error, but more often than not, there's some sort of human component associated with it. So if we look at that industry, I would say that's a really good illustration of how we can start to think about this challenge. And it's not a case of one or the other. You need both, but you really need to recognize what part the human plays in the system, and how do we, back to my phrase before, how do we get the best out of them? And we don't do that just by saying, you must slavishly follow rules. You say you must slavishly follow rules where that matters, but also we want you to think for yourself.
That's a brilliant example. And it really reinforces what you said earlier about creating the conditions where people feel like they can make those judgments, safely. And get back to the idea of trust and inspire. I mean, gosh, I'm inspired by that example, but it seems you have to create the conditions where your employees trust you as leadership will respond correctly or appropriately when they do speak up. So they do their job and they sit in that role of human eyes and ears on the ground that will report when they see something that's falling. But that's not going to happen, to your point, unless they can trust that the response will be appropriate.
Yeah. And I think, we intuitively know the employees on the front line, let's just use a sort of simple generalization, will have an awareness that is missing in the boardroom. And so there are these wonderful it's great TV, but it's shocking if you think about it from a cultural perspective. These TV shows where, undercover boss, where the CEO or whatever gets disguised and then goes to see what's actually happening in the business. And of course, the television show requires them to be shocked. Let's find the star employee who's doing amazing things, and let's find the shocking example of this. This is appalling. I hadn't realized this was going on. Makes great television. But then you think about it and go, why don't you know what's going on in your own organization? You should be identifying these rock stars that are really doing amazing things and rolling that out through, what can we learn from them throughout the organization? How do we hire them? How do we find more of them? But then equally, you should be right. These appalling practices. You shouldn't have to go and do an undercover TV show to discover these things. Now, of course, we know it's all slightly staged, blah, 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 blah. But bottom line is this idea of understanding what's happening in your business is absolutely critical, and thinking about the humans that are there. And, I love watching those shows because you see everything from sort of, undesirable outcomes to stupid bureaucratic processes that people have to circumvent in order to get a good outcome, and everything in between those two things. And so that for me is an illustration of the challenges of running businesses nowadays, particularly large, complex ones, where there is a distance between the decision makers and the reality on the ground. And I think that's an interesting analogy for compliance as a whole. We can often design things that will look good in the boardroom. There's an initiative that we love. We've got a great initiative. This will teach everybody what they need to do. But actually people on the ground go, what the hell is this? This is a load of nonsense. And so, that might be just a distance between the boardroom and the ground floor. That might be the fact that you've got an international organization. Something, I always used to say this, and I'm not picking on UBS. There's plenty of other examples of this. Something that sounds really good in Zurich might not land particularly well in Johannesburg or in Boise, Idaho, or wherever, right? It's the cultural differences, nature of businesses differences. And that's why I come back to that visceral experience. I say visceral, that sort of eye-opening experience that I had where I was in a bit of the business that I as a regulator hadn't considered before. And I'm not sure I would necessarily have cared because I've got a bigger risk I'm trying to mitigate, which is this firm doing something. But when I was looking at that thing and just going, there's a disconnect here. And I think we need to start removing these disconnects. And the trouble with modern organizations is that because of technology and we can, the potential for those disconnects to exist is huge because of distance, because of technology, because of what we can do, the sorts of activities businesses are able to quickly move into, a fast-moving world, all that kind of stuff can mean that actually a logical, we've codified the world, job done, actually is potentially very dangerous. So all of this stuff is fluid. And so that points to challenges back to the earlier questions about from regulators, that's challenges for compliance people. And businesses are trying to manage challenges because we've seen businesses can grow very, very quickly. They can also go extinct very, very quickly. So the speed of pace and change also adds to these dynamics as well. So this is, bottom line is this is really hard. And so one of the challenges I have is people go, oh my God, I've got enough complexity. I don't want you opening up another field of complexity by bringing this human stuff in. To which I say, you are running human risk whether you want to or not. If you employ people, this stuff is going on. And so you can either remain blind to it and then potentially get massively blindsided, or you can open the box and try and grapple with it. And so you can sort of ignore the things I'm saying if you want, but the dynamics I'm talking about will be there whether you want them to be there or not.
Yeah, and why might humans ignore the things you're saying? Because again, it makes abject sense, but I'm sure there's conditions at the top as well where people think, oh, don't want to know anymore, right? Like, and there's this idea of, you said it yourself, companies can go out of business instantly these days with reputational harm, with regulators. And I can see, I'm trying to have empathy here without condoning behaviors. I can see how, at the top of the chain, you might be like, well, I'm not going to be here forever. I just don't need this happening on my watch. And off I go, because the company might outlast the individual. So we really have to find a way to really mean what we say or operationalize our intentions. When we say, please see something, say something, rather than don't know, don't want to know, right? That's another disconnect we're going to have to bridge.
But all of this comes down to incentives, right? If I'm the CEO or the board member of a larger organization, and even a smaller organization, same challenge, is I sometimes have to think very, very short term, because I might want to do something that's for the good of the organization that could take some time to come to fruition. But actually, if my job is on the line, if I show 3/4 of losses, and this is where I think quarterly reporting is a nightmare, right? It's perfectly logical to say we need to keep a regular eye on what's going on. You must report back regularly so we can see what's happening. It's a sort of stock market induced logic. Makes perfect sense, but that doesn't encourage long-term thinking. Suddenly you're having to do things to look good. And we've all been, this ridiculous thing. Anybody that's worked in a company of any decent size will know things like, well, you better use your budget up before the year end, otherwise you're not going to get it again. Absurd behaviors like that, where you'd sort of say the sensible thing to do is not just to spend money because it's December, but actually I know that if I don't spend money, I'm never going to get that money. In fact, my budgets will then be cut for subsequent years, right? And people inflate budgets. People want larger team sizes so that if their teams are cut, they're still running something that's reasonably responsible, partly because they might want the ego of running a big team, but also because they want to justify their salary. If I cut your team in half, then why am I paying you so much money? Because you've got less of an empire, less responsibility in theory. So when we look at all of these dynamics that are there, it's not surprising that we have these challenges in the way companies are run, because chief execs are not necessarily incentivized to think longer term. And even these sort of like, I always think it's funny with things like sort of share options and those kinds of forms of remuneration, they in theory tie you into the long-term success of the firm. But actually, to a certain extent, you've still got to, you still want to keep your job to keep going for a while. So there are countervailing narratives that are there. And I think it's really interesting. I do quite a lot of work. I spend half my time in Germany, Munich, and half my time in the UK. And in Germany, I spend quite a lot of time working with very traditional companies that are family owned, that have been around for a long time, often really, really big, but you've never heard of them. And so they sort of phone me up and go, we're Europe's largest, blah, 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 blah. You will never have heard of us. And they're based in sort of small towns. I go to the outskirts of a big city in Germany and I find this small thing. And it's typically the largest employer in the small town that they're in. You get the sort of the metro system, get the final stop of the train, appear there. And the main square in the town is named after the founder of the company. There's a statue of them and their head office is right there, right? So they're really big in that local thing. But what's fascinating, you would think these would be really old school businesses where they're kind of very traditionalist, but actually they're the ones, because they're family owned, they're able to think long term and they are trying to genuinely protect the family legacy. And so when I've been talking about some of these quote unquote radical ideas, they land much more with people that have that commitment either to the region that they're in or to the family name that the business bears or all of those sorts of things. And so it's really, they're much more up for this. And yeah, it's anecdotal evidence, but what that sort of tells me is I think if we are part of the journey, if we feel like we're going to be on the journey for a long time, then we make a different set of decisions. We make a different decision if we're dating than we do if we're in a long-term relationship with someone. There's different dynamics at play. And I think the same is true of work. And I think one of the things that's interesting when we look at some of the shifts now of the sort of working patterns that people want, I've never understood the logic that says the employment contract that's there is always right. I need to buy 100% of your time. There are loads of jobs I've done in the past where actually, if they bought 50% of my time, that would have been enough, right? They fill the other 50%, and I'm probably being generous here. They fill the other 50% with sort of nonsense because they have to, because I have to buy 100% of your time. And it always occurred to me, wouldn't it be good to have people working, you don't want them working for a direct competitor, I can see that, but sort of, I don't know, like 40% of your time you work for a bank, 40% of the time you work for a not-for-profit or a bakery or something completely different, and then have a little bit more time for yourself, right? Wouldn't that be I think we get much better productivity out of people. And actually, you wouldn't then have these concerns about huge, because the cost base of an individual would be reduced by an amount, so you wouldn't have these sort of financial pressures. So my brain goes to sort of fantasy worlds, and I recognize this is not all straightforward, where I think some of the models that we've got, this you are full-time employed by one employer, is potentially incredibly risky if your interests are not 100% aligned with the employer. And this is the big compliance challenge. We design things on a presumption that the organization's interests are 100% aligned with the individual's interests. And the old line about sort of HR is not your friend. And if anybody for whom this comes as a shock, my biggest warning is we all make the assumption, well, they'll help me out. HR are not there to protect the individuals, they're there to protect the organization. And the moment your interests collide with the organization, HR, you know which side of the fence HR is going to be on. And it's understandable. And I think we design, so we know that dynamic, and yet we design compliance programs on the exact opposite presumption, right? That actually everybody's interests are always aligned. And so that leads us to flaws in the program. Employees talk about, well, this organization, what's going to keep this organization? This organization could fail if blah, 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 blah happen. Well, if you're thinking they might fire me tomorrow, or I'm not interested in a lifetime career here, well, suddenly your interest in theirs are diverged. And so if we apply logic, back to what I think was the original question, if we apply logic to the compliance program that says those interests are automatically aligned, we are missing a massive trick. And so when we communicate with people in compliance training, for example, I think it's really dangerous to always talk about what's in the interests of the company, because that only works if the individual's interests are aligned with the interests of the company. I would suggest that economic conditions, working patterns, and past experience teaches us that those alignments aren't, they're there in those smaller family-owned businesses. They're not always there in those larger organizations. And so if you get that wrong, then the risk that you run is that your thing completely misfires.
Christian, one of the reasons I love talking to you is that you do fantasize. I know you have those long train rides from London to Munich, and it gives you time to think about the edge of possibility here. And I like some of the things you're coming up with. Don't give those up, because they may be the future of work. One of my fantasies is a word you mentioned, legacy. I've got this idea that whether you're at the top or the bottom, if you can tap into somebody's personal legacy, we will have our interests aligned. That's the thought I've got here. Just, what is it? How can we speak the same language to everyone? And that might be the clue. We'll see. The other thing you mentioned was another phrase I like to use is crowdsourcing risk intelligence. I'm going to modify it now and call it crowdsourcing human risk intelligence in your honor. But I think there's got to be a way for us to bring ease and peace of mind and make sure that people can actually get that information quickly. across massive organizations and industries. I don't know if you have the GPS navigator Waze. In the UK, we use it a lot here in the US. And in a way, that's what I'm doing on my journey there. I'm crowdsourcing risk intelligence from the other drivers. Like someone would be on my exact route ahead of me 20 minutes and they can tell me what the problems are. And Waze can also tell me what I need to know about safety on that journey. I'd love to see something like that. We crowdsourced risk intelligence. And just by adding the word human risk intelligence, I think could be so powerful, because then it's an acknowledgement that we are all flawed, right? And back to your point, like it's okay to be flawed and help each other keep moving forward. So just some fantasy ideas that you've tapped on there. I don't know, again, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I love that idea of sort of crowdsourcing collective wisdom. There are examples, of course, where the crowd is wrong. I'm not going to get political now. I'm going to focus, for example, on music, right? Things that make it to the top of the charts are not necessarily the best bits of music out there, right? So some appalling things have become very, very popular. But equally, we can sort of see that generally speaking, if you get more people involved in the decision, you will get a more balanced decision. And that's where diversity really, and inclusion, of course, really, really important to have those different perspectives. And that stops us doing it the way we've always done it. And we start to challenge and think fresh ways of doing things. So I think that's awesome. And I think you're right, recognizing that we're all flawed and we can get things wrong. And those flaws are brilliant features as well. Right, people who kind of screw something up and then an amazing invention comes from it, or make a mistake and realize something that they didn't realize before. So we want people to continue to make mistakes and get it wrong. But there are some things where we don't need to have mistakes, and actually collective wisdom is a brilliant thing. And so I love this idea of crowdsourcing. I think Waze is a really good illustration as well. If you think about it, is everybody's in that. You will give information to that because you're also getting something back at some point. So you might not, in that moment, you might be stuck in a traffic jam, feeding some useful information. You're getting nothing in that, but you're kind of paying it forward or paying it back on some level. Right. And there's a collective experience there. And I love this idea of us, in a world where we're being divided and all the differences that we have are being pointed out, and echo chambers and all those sorts of things. I love that idea of something that's a bit more collegiate and supportive, and recognizing that we are all the same because we're all humans, but we're not all the same. And that's not an awful thing. That's a beautiful thing where we can bring different perspectives in. And that should, as a species, stop us screwing up.
I mean, look, one of the themes is if back to your contract fallacies, well, we're all disposable and replaceable. But this legacy, this crowd sharing, this paying it forward taps into that kind of old apprenticeship ideal, right? Like your history isn't lost, and you can pass it forward to the next generation or the next set of workers, whatever it may be, to your team as a leader. So there's something to it. We'll have to keep noodling over it, Christian. Now, listen, I know we're going to have to close soon, so I feel this is like a very unfair question to ask you to close. And I know that listeners can get a lot more from your books and everything on your website, so please share those resources with us. But what would be your advice to those of us trying to get the best out of other humans at work?
So I think two things. The first one I would say is that we need to recognize the realities that are out there, right? Which is that humans have flaws, humans will make mistakes. So this back to that phrase I used earlier, we need to think not how we would like people to behave, but how they are likely to behave. And I think that's really important. So when people don't do what we predict, is recognizing that there will be some valid reason that is making them do that. And so if it doesn't match our expectations of it, recognize that that's possible, design rules and processes around it for that. So that's the first bit, is recognize the realities of human decision-making. I think the second thing is, if we are looking at what makes us human, it is our individual personalities, experiences, stories, all those sorts of things. And so I want to encourage people to just bring those out more. What engages people isn't sort of dull, repeat, you could get it from anyone. I want to have a conversation with you, Hemma, that is just uniquely you, that is bringing out your particular experiences. And I think often corporate environments stifle that. Right. People are not allowed to express themselves. Now, I'm not saying you give people free rein to go crazy and do whatever they want, but I think a bit more allowing people to share their stories, be themselves, express their viewpoints, we get the best out of people, because that's a really, really human attribute. AI doesn't have opinions on things, doesn't have experiences that with emotions attached to it. And I think we need to get more of that out of people. And I would encourage everybody to start thinking about, what is your story? Tell your story. How do you, because that's how you engage other people. And I find, social media will be my classic example of where that happens really well and really badly. There are some amazingly engaging things on social media that are very original, that are people just being themselves and people telling great stories. And then there's just this generic crap that's there that is just following somebody else's formulaic boilerplate. And that frustrates me, because I think if you're just following somebody else's pattern, that's just catering, right? That's not providing high quality content and cuisine for people. And so I want to see a bit more of that in people, because I think that's where the magic lies.
Pure magic. Christy, you know, this podcast is called Unless because of the quote from the Lorax by Dr. Seuss: unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. Now, I know it's not very British to see yourself in that quote, but that's what I see in you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for caring enough to spread your wisdom, because, as you said, the magic is out there if we can just lean into it. And so I'm very inspired, and I'm really grateful to you for sharing all this with our listeners. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.